Hello, welcome again to the episode in the Let Fuel Prosper series. My name is Dr. Vance, Ginn. I hope you're having a prosperous day. Well, today we have someone who has been on the front lines talking about corporate welfare, fighting against big government socialism, and just an overall around great guy. And it's none other than John Mozena. John, welcome to the Let Fuel Prosper show.
Great to be here.
Good. Well, it's a pleasure to have you on today. We're going to have a great conversation talking about corporate welfare, socialism, and all the other things that hold us back from being as prosperous as we should be, and what we need to do about it. So we've got a lot to talk about because there's way too much of that going on across the country. Let me read the bio real quick for the audience, and so they'll have a good idea of who you are. So John, he's the president of the Center for Economic Accountability and has been on both sides of the economic development wars. A longtime marketing and communications professional and former journalist, he spent 2 decades in private sector agency and corporate roles where his clients often included economic development entities and programs. After leaving the private sector, John became the vice president for marketing and communication at the Mackinac Center for Public Policy, Michigan's free market public policy think tank. He left the Mackinac Center in 2017 and served as a marketing and communications consultant for public policy organizations while working with the CEA's co-founders to launch it at the end of 2018. He is a graduate of the Atlas Network Academy, including its think tank leadership training program, a member of the American Enterprise Institute Leadership Network, a fellow at the Better Cities Project, and holds an accreditation in public relations from the Public Relations of Society of America. So a lot of great stuff there, John, to go on. But let's start off with, like I do all the guests, what motivates you to do what you do each and every day?
When I know you asked your guest that question, and I sort of actually made me stop and think, like, why do I do what I do? That's a very good question, and it's one I should probably ask myself a couple of years ago. I think there's 2 ways to answer that. The first is, like, why do I try to work for prosperity and free markets and individual liberty? It's simply because I've lived long enough and I've seen enough parts of the world that I know they work, and I care about people, and I want to live in a better world, and I want my son to grow up in a better world, and I want everyone's sons and daughters to grow up in a better world. And I believe that free markets and individual liberty and the rule of law is the way you get there. You just look at the world throughout history, and that's how it is. I spent time living in Europe in the early late 1990s, and the difference between right after the wall came down, the difference between East and West was so clear. Anybody who went there and saw that in action, it was just like, well, duh, of course this is what works. And then sort of more specifically, why do I work on the world of economic development policy reform? It basically came down to, like, someone has to. When I was at the Mackinac Center, I like I said, I'd been on the other side of this debate. And one of the things I came to realize was that, this is such a big problem, and there was nobody out there who was, there were plenty of folks who were doing some research on it and the like, but there was nobody who was really dedicated to really focusing their efforts on this problem. No organization that was really dedicated to trying to figure out how to make the case effectively against these, try to really grab people. And at the end of the day, this is not a research issue. I mean, we have the research. As you read my bio, I'm not an economist. I joke, I talk to economists so you don't have to. No offense to my economist friends. And I'm not a policy wonk in terms of doing white papers and the like, but there is plenty of research, and the policy is often pretty simply like, don't do it. Like, so much of chapter 313 or whatever the Texas State Code that says we do economic development is repealed. It's not that difficult. What it is it's an advocacy issue. It's a marketing communications issue. It's a changing the way people think and feel about this stuff issue. And that's what I can do. So I and my fellow founding board members decided that there needed to be an organization that was really just focused on the issue of state and local government economic development policy, and getting it away from corporate welfare and central planning and top down, and trying to move them toward a model of creating a environment that was conducive to people being able to start and run good businesses that create good jobs and make their communities better places.
No, that's great, John, and I appreciate all the work that you've been doing on that. And because we need more information about all these welfare programs, corporate welfare programs that are going on, and it's good to hear also about the Center for Economic Accountability. Are there specific priorities that you have there that you work on daily?
I mean, really, the heart of our mission and the heart of what we're trying to do is really just to get people to understand what's really going on, because there really is. I mean, people talk all the time these days about misinformation and disinformation. And I would argue that there are very few areas of public policy where the difference between what all the research says and what a really broad range of economists from all over the political spectrum, this is not a partisan issue, agree on what the economic reality of these programs are versus how they are sold by sort of the combined forces of big business and big government. I mean, you've got the politicians who are using these things as adjuncts to re-election campaigns. You've got the bureaucrats and the agencies who are supposed to be the ones representing our interests, but they instead use it as basically a full employment act and are captured by the business interests. And then you got the business interests who are catching the checks, and they all are singing from the same hymnal of how great these programs are. And so the polling company, there's some polling that the State Policy Network has just come out with that it hasn't been widely released yet, but we're allowed to talk about it, which they found that more than half of American voters think these programs are worth the cost, and a fifth or less think they aren't, and 70% think they create jobs and build businesses. And that's the thing we need to take on, because until you change the way people think and feel about these things, until you sort of move that Overton window and change the climate of public opinion, politicians are going to have no incentive to change any of the policies. Occasionally you might run into a situation like Texas did a couple of years ago of Chapter 313, where there was enough of a furor in the moment that people were able to realize this program was wrong, and there was enough of a particular issue that they were able to shut that down. But in general, it's going to be very difficult to do.
Yeah, no, that's right. And I think it goes into a lot of the public choice economics, right? With James
Absolutely.
Buchanan, Gordon Tullock, talking about
100%.
rent seeking, whenever there's always this, I like the way they put it as well, because, in the private sector, we talk about people having these marginal costs and marginal benefits, and they weigh out to make rational decisions and things of that nature. But we often forget, or some believe anyway, that politicians are angels, and they make rational decisions for all of us and are able to do these things in kind of a closed doors and make sure that everything is best for the people. But we got to remember that they're also rational in the sense that they want to be reelected. They've got to make sure that they're giving out these sweetheart deals, and that's why spending continues to soar and all the other things. And as you mentioned, in Texas, which is where I live, near Austin, we had this Chapter 313, which is basically a property tax abatement for school districts to be able to issue to where they get a huge discount over about 10 years. And there's different deals that they'll run, and the comptroller would approve it. But basically, it was like, as long as you submitted all the information, you're going to get approved. And there was a lot of these happening across the state, billions of dollars. And the talk of the town was like, look, there's not a cost. It's all a benefit to taxpayers in the process. And it's like, no, that's not true. That they're getting an abatement, which means that everyone is paying higher property taxes in the process. And so it just shifts the burden around. And so as we went into the 2021 legislative session in Texas, people were talking about, how do we change it? Because it expired December 2022. To your point about it, it's pretty simple to get rid of these. And there was just, nobody could come up with the best path. It almost happened right at the end of session, and then it collapsed. Now, some of the argument is, John, that they were waiting until the next session to redo it, which they did here in 2023. They made it a new chapter, I think Chapter 401 or 402, something like that. But it's essentially the Chapter 313 with a little bit less teeth than the original one. And so it goes back into this game of like, well, it's just a shell game of moving things around until they can get more clout, more power to provide those sort of services in the process. And John, the last thing here is that they'll just say, well, but other states are doing it. If we don't do it, how are we going to be competitive? And so it's just interesting to see these different dynamics going on in Texas, but I'm sure you've been seeing this for years.
That argument drives me absolutely nuts. First off, to steal a line from our mutual friend, Mike Lefebvre, who runs economic policy at the Mackinac Center for Public Policy in Michigan, if all you're doing is shooting yourself in the foot, then unilateral disarmament's a great idea. Like, the evidence is very clear. These programs don't help the local economy. They don't create jobs. And all we're doing is wasting money. So yeah, unilateral disarmament's a great idea, but on a sort of more philosophical level, more sort of a broad macroeconomic level. I'm trying to get, this is one of the things we're working on these days. We've sort of started talking in this occasionally about as sidewalk level socialism. I'm not one who throws around the term socialism broadly. I call everything I don't like socialism, but I'm enough of I studied political science back in the early 1990s, and the definition of socialism as is state ownership of the means of production when you've got governments having a financial interest in businesses so that they can, nominally use that financial stake they have in those businesses to try to micromanage the economy. Yeah, it's getting kind of socialisty around here. And that's really what these programs are. I mean, they are central economic planning if you believe what they are saying about them. I mean, the reality is that they're political tools. We could talk about that a little bit more. But the nature of these things is that, they are fundamentally accepting the socialist argument that governments can and should micromanage the economy, and that if they do that, they'll be better at it. The economy will be better. People will be better off than if the free market had been left to run its course. So what every governor, including some of the most theoretically fiscally conservative Republican, whatever, out there, is when they say, well, I hate these things and I don't want to do them, but we can't unilaterally disarm, the argument they are making is the socialist argument that if they leave their economy free, they will not be able to compete with the centrally planned and controlled economies of their neighbors, which means they are betting on East Germany over West Germany. They're betting on North Korea over South Korea. They're betting on the People's Republic of China over Taiwan or pre-reunification Hong Kong. They are betting on the model that we just spent the last century realizing doesn't work. And nobody is calling them out on that. And so that's one of the things that we've started doing, is calling them like, really? Do you really believe that? Is that actually what you think is going to happen? Because that's kind of interesting, because that's not what you say happens in every other facet of society. And that really comes down to, I talked about the really broad academic consensus against there being economic value to these things. The corollary to that is that there is a growing body of research showing that and quantifying a really strong political value to these programs. Big one, Professor Nate Jensen at the University of Texas in Austin, your hometown there, and Evan Molesky at Duke. They went out trying to quantify the political value to a swing state governor who runs for re-election and can claim, quote, winning, unquote, 1,000 manufacturing jobs in the subsidy program. And they found it doesn't really change the partisans on one side or the other very much. But in the middle, the independents, where elections get won or lost, it can change independent voter intent by as much as 9%. Now, you switch independent voters by 9% toward you, you're going to win a heck of a lot of elections. And politicians and their campaign consultants might not know that specific number, but they know for darn sure that these programs are politically valuable. That's why in this past election cycle, there were 7 states where governors who were running for re-election signed or announced billion-dollar-plus subsidy deals. In all 7 states, those governors were re-elected. I'm not going to claim correlation and causation on that exactly, but it sure as heck didn't hurt. We know from research from folks at Penn State and Georgetown that companies that make political donations to the relevant elected officials are 4 times more likely to get these subsidies, and those subsidies are 63% larger than those who don't. We know from professors at Princeton and Columbia that the single biggest determinant of whether a state will see a sudden large jump in these programs and the spending in these programs year to year isn't the unemployment rate. It's not recession or anything like that. Has nothing to do with the economic cycle. It has to do with the electoral calendar. And what it is that a state where a governor is running for re-election is twice as likely to see a sudden large jump in subsidy spending as those that aren't. Can't find any economic value, can find all sorts of political value. And that's the fundamental thing. You want to go looking for the dark money in politics, start with your local economic development agency, because that's really where it is. And it's your tax dollars, not your political donations, that are really funding these things.
Yeah, that's right. And have you calculated what the total amount is of kind of corporate welfare economic development across the country? Or, I mean, I know it's different in each state and everything, but do you happen to have like what a broad number would be?
I have not done that.
Okay.
I am numbers and I are not happy things together. I
Sure.
leave that to the actual economists. Then I just reflect that. Before the pandemic and before the federal government's money fire hose really just like threw everything into disarray. And I've been actually trying to poke a couple of economists I know who are in this world to sort of say, hey, it's be a good project, about time for somebody to go out and back and add this up again. The best estimate was from our friends at the Mercatus Center, was that in 2019 or so, it was about $95 billion around the country, which the example I use is that at the time, that was enough to cover the 11 smallest state budgets combined. I mean, this is real money, and it's only gone significantly higher since then. I mean, like I would not be surprised if it were triple that now, and I'm not even joking about that because of the fact that previously, you look back to about 1980 or so, which is about as far back as we have good data, and the record, if you sort of inflation adjust all the numbers, the record for $1 billion plus subsidy deals across the country in a year was 3. There'd never been many years more than 3 of them. Last year, we had arguably 12. And again, in this world, the numbers get a little fuzzy because sometimes it's like, well, if they create X many jobs, or do you count the local government's property taxes or whatever, at some point you're losing billions of dollars here and there. You don't even know where they went. But when you had, people talk about exponential growth a lot, and they misuse that term to mean like a lot of growth. No, this was literally exponential growth in the number of $1 billion plus deals across the country last year. Fueled in large part by federal industrial policy money, by the sort of COVID quote bailouts that created all this money sloshing around state budgets, and by the fear of politicians who had angry constituents and whose constituents were saying, "Hey, please, fix the economy. The economy's weird. I don't like this. Fix it." And the politicians wanted to be seen to be doing it. The thing that I find much more interesting than sort of the national level actually is often trying to get people to realize how much of a problem this is. One of the things we enjoy doing is looking at the local level and the state level and coming and answering that question. So things like in New York City, again, in 2019, they reported more money lost to corporate tax abatements than they appropriated that year to run the New York Fire Department and Department of Corrections combined. So the fire department and the jails had more money going out the door in corporate tax breaks than they spent on those things that actually make a difference in people's lives.
Right.
I know you've done work in Louisiana.
Yep.
Louisiana has a horrific set of issues with this. I mean, the state last year, I went and read these numbers. Last year, there we had $540 million in tax abatements, $212 million in straight just economic development spending. So total price tag about $750 million. For one thing, the state collected $1 billion in corporate income tax that year. So 3/4 of the money that they collected in corporate income tax went back out the door in some form of economic development. But I also like the joke that say, the state's license plate says Sportsman's Paradise. And I love Louisiana. It's a gorgeous state and it's a great place to spend time. But they spent, when you look at the state budget last year, they spent less money on conservation and environment, culture and tourism, and agriculture and forestry, which is about $677 million, than they did on economic development. So I've joked that if there was a truth in advertising law for license plates, Louisiana should have to say corporate welfare paradise and not sportsman's paradise, because they're spending more on the corporate welfare than they are on the sportsman.
Wow. Thanks for sharing some of those numbers. And it's unfortunate too, because in places like Louisiana, people are leaving. You would think that they had the 3rd most number of people, but in percentage wise, a net out migration from Louisiana last year. And it's unfortunate because you're right. It is a great place to live, and good family location and food and everything else, tourism and everything else that's happening there. But a lot of these bad policies are driving people out. I talk a lot about the excessive government spending and high taxes and complicated tax structure that they have. The burden, Tax Foundation will show, is pretty low when you think about the amount that they're paying, but it's so complicated in the multiple taxes that they have. And I think they try to cover up some of that with these economic development, corporate welfare deals, because they are trying to keep people there. And in their mind, I guess their best excuse or best reason for doing it is that they want to keep people there. So let's provide tax breaks that will incentivize people to be there. Because I guess, John, taking a step back real quick, is that the reason why we have economic development is that these individuals, whenever it really got started, which might be a good question to ask you, when did all this really start? But it basically says that markets are failing. The market is failing to best allocate resources. But it's determined on the individual who's doing the subjective valuation to determine where the resources should be allocated. So they're the ones that's saying, it's a misallocation of resources. The markets are failing. And so that you mentioned this earlier, they could come in and reset everything to get it to where it should be, but it's based on their subjective valuation, not on the markets. That's why these things don't last long and they fail, and it's a distortion in the market and everything else. But it seems like, instead of going the route of spending less, sound tax policy and things of that nature, they would rather double down on bad policy than pass good policy. Is that what you've seen as well?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Because the thing is, you asked the question back a little, like, where did this start? One of the points I always love making is that one of the sort of seminal founding moments of America was a rebellion against corporate welfare. The Boston Tea Parties, you sort of learn in school, the colonists were unhappy about the tax on tea. No, the tax on tea had existed for many years at that point. What the colonists were really cranky about was suddenly the British East India Company had gotten a special tax abatement on tea that nobody else got. And so that they were getting to send their tea to the colonies untaxed and to put all the colonial business people out of business. That was why there was the British East India Company's tea that ended up in the harbor. And so I always do love the fact that, from our, like, even before we were a country, we were cranky about corporate welfare. Of course, one of as far as we know, I think the first person to get a corporate subsidy from the American government was himself, Alexander Hamilton, for a company he was setting up. So it goes both ways there. It's a perfect example of the kind of thing where people have wonderful principles, but then when their own pocketbooks are on the line, they lose sight of those principles. But at that same time, almost literally exactly at that same time, we were getting the answer to what economic development should look like. When Adam Smith was going around and asking the question, in the Wealth of Nations, like, what makes some places prosperous and others not? And when he sort of was asked by his friend famously to sort of sum it up, I don't have time to read your book, sum it up for me. And he said, peace, easy taxes, and a tolerable administration of justice. I'd like to say transplant that to the modern era, and it's peace/public safety, easy taxes, that stays the same, and a tolerable regulatory state. We don't have to guess at what actually matters to companies, because the companies themselves are perfectly happy to tell us in the aggregate. Every year, Area Development Magazine, or sort of like the two big magazines in the site selection economic development industry, for 37 years, they've been surveying corporate site selectors on what factors matter to you the most. And it changes over time. Recently, energy costs and energy reliability went up fairly significantly in those rankings. It's almost always workforce cost and availability is number one, and then sort of what you'd expect if you've spent any time in the business world. Things like construction costs, infrastructure quality, access to resources, all these sorts of sort of basic business factors. And it's not that, tax abatements and other forms of corporate subsidies aren't on that list. It's that they're generally in, like, at best 8th. This year, they're 13th on the list. So they're there, but they play a very small role in actually changing where companies are going to go and what they're going to do there. So, that's the thing about this is if these programs work, if people were in good faith going out, trying to identify actual market failures somehow, and they had some mechanism that they thought they could actually use to do it, and then they were subsidizing those companies that they had identified as being market failures, and that their success would provide a positive ROI to the community. If they were capable of doing that, then, like, okay, then this would be like any other government program argument about, like, is it worth what we're spending on it? The problem is, like, if people could actually do that, they wouldn't be making, civil service salaries in state capitals. They'd be making billions on Wall Street or in hedge funds. That is something that there is a gigantic industry of really smart people trying to do that and failing probably more often than not. Just the idea that this sort of goes back to this whole socialist fallacy of the lack of information, the lack of it, even of the best intentioned people. When you're not using this as a political hack tool, when you're not using this as an adjunct to your reelection campaign or to get the voters happy with you, if you're actually trying to do it right. And I know for a fact there are legislators, elected officials, governors, bureaucrats, also there are folks out there who are trying to do this right, and with the best and most pure of intentions, they are trying to. I've met them, I've talked to them, and I really wish they were capable of doing it, but they're just not. They're just not. Like I'm from the Detroit area, and just, I have had a front row seat for the past, 40 years to the decline and fall, in many ways, of the American automotive industry, despite billions and billions and billions and billions of dollars from the state level alone, not even talking about the federal government, in subsidies. We spent, billions of dollars on this industry, and we have hundreds of thousands of fewer manufacturing jobs in the state than when we started. You cannot subsidize your way to prosperity. No place has done that. There's a great line about Kansas City. As you know, Kansas City was the subject of the border war where Kansas and Missouri were fighting back and forth with subsidies. Friend Patrick Toohey, who was at the time down at the Show Me Institute down there, jokes that if these things worked, then Kansas City would look like Dubai on the Missouri River.
Nice. Oh man. One of the things that I was thinking, John, as you were going through that, which was some really good points about intentions, and Milton Friedman, one of my favorite economists, said, don't judge a policy by its intentions, but by its results. And the results here just don't match what the intentions are. And I agree with you. I think that the legislators and their staff, they're trying to do what they think is right. They're trying to do what's best for their district and everything else. And yes, I do think that part of it is to win re-election and to have those ribbon cutting ceremonies, and so that they could be there and get the media and press. I think that some of that's there, but I think that they do want to provide jobs for their community and everything else. But the problem is, and you were laying it out well there, is the knowledge problem, from Hayek, talking about, it's very difficult for the market itself to work, for people to come together. And the way it comes together is through spontaneous order, allowing that through prices to allocate resources. That's really the signals that we need, that sets these subjective values to come together in the marketplace for exchange. Whenever you start throwing in a third party to try to determine what those market transactions are going to be, with the limited knowledge and also the limited moral values and other types of values that individuals in the marketplace has, you're always going to get it wrong. And I think you're bringing up some great points there, where if we really wanted to do that, we should just be like China. We should just be a communist, socialist country, and forget about our republic and our capitalism and everything else. And we kind of are doing that to some extent, but not nearly the level that China is. And we understand that China has not performed very well. Yes, they may reach us in GDP numbers here pretty soon, if you believe their data. But per capita, they're still very poor. They're well below where we are because of the innovation, the technology, the prices, the market signals that are throughout our economy that allow for people to flourish. And so it's really unfortunate that we have folks in red states in particular, and in blue states too, but you have this push for more corporate welfare. And John, you also brought up a great point, and I did some work at the federal level in the White House for about a year. And, it's also Republicans and Democrats that are in the executive branch and in Congress that are pushing these big government policies. And today they're talking a lot of it being industrial policy, the new right, the national conservatives and things of that nature. And that's something that's concerning to me, because now it's, if we just had the right people in power, that we can make these decisions work. We could get the outcomes that we want, no matter what the results have been and the intentions in the past. And that really is concerning to me, John, of local, state, and federal government. But I wonder what you say about that.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And the talking about China, I really do worry that the constant drumbeat of I mean, really, it's propaganda. I mean, it is go look, just if your listeners are at all interested in this, just go to your state economic development agency's homepage and go to the news tab and look at the press releases and look at what the headlines say. And it's Governor so-and-so announces 50 jobs here, 25 jobs here. It's like no sparrow shall fall. It's like no sparrow shall get a job in your state without the governor taking credit for it somehow. And that really does send a message. And when it's an everyday drumbeat and everything you hear over and over again, it really does normalize the idea that prosperity comes from the government, from top down, from smart people making these decisions, rather than, just to coin a phrase, letting people prosper, giving them the freedom and giving them an environment where they are free and it is safe, and there is a rule of law that everybody understands and agrees to, that keeps everybody's property safe, and they can They could work out disagreements with each other and enforce contracts. To get more wonky, people say, well, if we don't do these, what do we do? I mean, if I hear one thing from the legislators I talk to, it's, well, if not this, then what? I got to have something to show my constituents. I can't say I voted against jobs creation without something to show them. And I can't just be like, oh, well, studies show, because they're not going to listen to that. And, as a practical level, I'm just like, well, just tell them that it was, you were being asked to pay too much. It was a dumb price. It was a bad deal. Like, that's a perfectly valid answer, because that's actually true. There are very, very few of these subsidies that you can, there's a famous piece, Peter Fischer's and Alan Peter at the University of Iowa a couple of years back in the Journal of the American Planning Association, came out with this piece, and they basically concluded that 90% of economic development money is wasted. And I talked to Dr. Fischer and I asked him the question, and I was like, well, what about that? Can we identify that 10% ahead of time? And he said, no. The one place that I've ever seen numbers, and again, I'm not an economist, so I don't claim this exactly. The one place I've seen a very good argument that a particular subsidy is going to work just sort of generally, and I sort of set my libertarian principles aside on this, is if you actually develop a subsidy that companies get paid for hiring someone who's currently on unemployment, because it is, whatever subsidy you give is almost certainly less than what taxpayers are spending to keep that person on public assistance. That is but that's less of an economic development thing and more of sort of government spending thing. But the broader issue of sort of like the whole industrial policy and all of that, I have been to a couple places around the country that these big headline deals are happening to. And I use that phrase, happening to, very specifically, places where, these gigantic battery factories, which are basically chemical plants, are getting plopped down into these rural communities because they want these big rural areas. And the people there are freaking out. It is just this top down from Washington, D.C., and then here in Michigan from Lansing, getting slammed down this community, and it's happening behind closed doors, and everybody's signing non-disclosure agreements so you can't find out what's going on. And people are terrified for their way of life. And you're not living in a community like that by accident. You're living in a community like that, Marshall, Michigan, Big Rapids, Michigan, places that are sort of, not middle of nowhere, but sort of more farming community type things, rural communities. And people are all of a sudden getting this gigantic factory plopped down in their backyard. And that's the antithesis of how we're supposed to run things in America. If a company wanted to go there, buy stuff, and sort of like do it on their own, that's the marketplace. But to have it happen because elected officials and bureaucrats decided this is what our country needs, like, the people there are saying, well, what about us? That's not how this is supposed to work.
Yeah, no, that's right. And I think it goes back to what you were saying earlier, and we've been talking about here, is we need to get back to simplicity. Keep it simple, stupid. Less spending, less regulation, lower taxes. That's the way to pro-growth, and it's better for people. And so people can flourish, they can get jobs, they can get all those things that I think, politicians seem to want to hand out, but instead do it in a way that maybe they don't get as much credit for. But at the end of the day, that's going to bring about long-term self-sufficiency so people can get out of poverty. That's going to bring about new entrepreneurs who can come in and design the next big thing. I mean, one thing after another that it can lead to, instead of trying to direct resources across the economy. And so, John, this has been a great discussion. And as we're wrapping up here, what do you think would be the best thing for governments to do, or for people to push for? I'm a fan of like spending limits at the state level and at the federal level, all the levels. Actually, I think spending is the ultimate problem with government, and so if we can get rid of, or at least reduce a lot of spending, that will help free up a lot of resources elsewhere. But are there certain maybe limitations or constitutional rules or some sort of rules that you would like to see done across the states?
I mean, there's a variety of things. I would love to just say, hey, just get rid of these programs altogether, but we live in the real world, and I recognize the challenges, of getting us to a point where people think that that's a good idea. Like I said, more than half of Americans think these things work. We have to change our minds on that. So when I talk to legislators and others around the country, we talk about a model of change that looks like transparency, then accountability, then reform. So start with transparency. My organization, we were one of the founding members of a coalition, the Ban Secret Deals Coalition, tried to get states to pass laws banning the use of non-disclosure agreements that Basically, it's where politicians and bureaucrats are signing away the public's right to know. They're going even further than the Freedom of Information Act and Open Meeting Act limitations that most of these programs have, and signing non-disclosure agreements that make it so people can't find out what's going on. Look, nothing good happens behind closed doors, and especially nothing good happens behind closed doors when it's people deciding where millions or even billions of dollars are going. There's a reason that there's a whole lot of corruption stories, a whole lot of convictions around these programs across the country. This is a very place where it's just really rife with the potential for corruption, and the more transparency you can shine at. So the things like making sure that governments are abiding by the Government Accounting Standards Board rules that require them to actually report how much tax revenues they're losing on this. There's actually a Government Accounting Board standard on that, but a whole lot of places don't abide by it, and that creates real problems. So getting rid of the NDAs, requiring that the information about deals be public for a certain length of time before they get voted on. So whether it's the individual voters or even the competitors in the market who can see the problems with that and want to be able to talk about it, to be able to make a case against the deal beforehand. There's also like almost 75% support among voters for putting big deals in front of voters, letting them make the decision themselves. For those of your folks who aren't watching this on YouTube, you see over my shoulder there's a thing on my wall that says "Pay for your own damn stadium." Stadium subsidies are probably the most egregious version of this. And there's a real strong, when places where voters are given a choice on stadium subsidies, quite often they say no. They just don't think it's a good deal. So putting more choices in front of voters, giving them the say, and that's good politically because the politician can say, I supported the thing. Don't blame me for not happening. It was the voters' fault. They get the credit for supporting the deal without the cost of having to actually pay for it down the road. And then over time, really putting some more teeth into audits. You'll never find anybody who hates these programs more than state auditors. If you ever want to read some really passive aggressive stuff about economic development, read the state auditors report on them, because I've seen some ones that are just like nuke them from orbit, scathing about these programs. Problem is, nobody pays attention to state auditors reports, so you don't know the difference. But starting with transparency, going on to accountability, and really making the difference there, because by the time you get people knowing what's going on and understanding the ROI of what's going on, the choice to change what's going on will be a lot easier.
Yeah. Great points there, John. I hope we can get more of those implemented across the country, because this is just not a good direction that we need to go for free market capitalism, which is the best path to prosperity. And so there's a good direction that we need to have here. Continue to do the great work that you're doing. God bless you and your family. And I hope that the Center for Economic Accountability continues to grow with influence and help so many people out. So I really appreciate you being on the program today.
Thanks for having me, Vince. I enjoyed the discussion.
Okay, great. Well, for the audience, thank y'all for joining us today. It was a great discussion here with John. Go out and subscribe and give us a 5-star rating if you enjoyed the program, or wherever you get your program, whether it be YouTube or all the other platforms that are out there. And until next time, let people prosper.